Fedor Dostoevsky, Chapter 4. Final chapter. Dostoevsky has said to himself that without the Russian earth, quote, all my strength and my talent would dry up, close quote. And it was his conviction that man's spiritual catastrophe would be inescapable when he loses his ties with the soil, the people, and humanity. Alienation from God would be the logical consequence of such a detachment. The absence of faith results in the revolt against God's moral law and in man's arrogant claim to rule his own destiny. Dostoevsky has no academic arguments to offer for faith, but leads us, like Dante, through the hellish tortures of those who have abandoned it. In some instances, intellectual atheism received a short shrift in Dostoevsky's novels and in his other writings. He makes, for example, Nicholas Vovolostovich in The Possessed say, quote, an atheist can't be a Russian. An atheist ceases at once to be a Russian, close quote. Shatov in the same novel remarks, quote, Russia's atheism has never proceeded beyond the joking stage, close quote. Kirilov's statement echoes some Darwinian thinking when he expresses the fear that mankind might now descend from God to gorilla since he has risen from gorilla to God. And Peter Verkovensky, The Possessed, makes the prophetic statement about Russia's future that, quote, a Russian revolution will unfailingly start with atheism. Religion was to Dostoevsky so much a part of Russia's climate and geography that the Russians would make, quote, a religion of atheism if they ever embraced it, close quote. But his thinking is more universal than this close tie between religion and patriotism might indicate. Shortly before his death, a woman correspondent complained to him that the road to clarity and moral freedom was a painful struggle and a never-ending conflict. His rather impatient reply was, quote, what are you writing me of your inner conflicts? To have these is obviously the trait of all humans, that is, of all those who are above the ordinary. It causes great pains, but also extreme joy, close quote. His novels dramatize the duality of man and illustrate his conviction that a life lived only according to human self-direction will invariably lead to a subhuman existence. Man must not be reconciled to himself. This note is always the same whether we follow the megalomaniac student Raskolnikov into the criminal hitherlands of his mind, or see Ivan Karamazov and his father sink into debaucheries, or watch Dmitri indulge in unbridled eroticism, or hear the demon-ridden Kirilov cry out, quote, God has pursued me all my life, close quote. It is a despair akin for Kierkegaard's fear and trembling, and Faust's, quote, two souls residing in my breast, close quote. These vacillations between light and dark make young Arkady, in The Raw Youth, ask himself how it is that the barest motives in man can exist side by side with the utmost sincerity and purity. Same way God and the devil exist in him. The powers, that's my own footnote, sorry. The powers of reason, which had been exalted for almost a century before Dostoevsky's dramatized this struggle between the light and darkness, had proved incapable of solving this breach in man's personality. Logic, intelligence, and reason could not master the dark forces in man that had a volition of their own and a hidden purpose. The mysterium iniquitatis is more than ordinary moral guilt. It is a metaphysical problem. Man is bound to be guilty. Our reasoning judgment can only intensify our pain, not relieve it. For, quote, the good that I would do not, but the evil which I would not, that I do. Romans 7:19. It is indeed a mystery, and atheism has exploited it as thoroughly as possible. But reasoning and understanding, both divinely created, cannot comprehend their creator, and the mystery is not resolved by calling it nonsense. Nicholas Berdayev sums up the essence of Dostoevsky's faith by stating that the existence of evil proves God's existence. A holy, good, and righteous world would have no need for God. Quote, for the world itself would be God, close quote. And he concludes that God is because evil exists, close quote. And that means that God is because freedom is, close quote. Guilt and sin, then, are an existential condition of man, and the problem of human guilt is central in Dostoevsky's thinking. His typical Russian emphasis on man as a collective being leads logically to his belief in our all guilt. We are, again, in some mysterious manner, guilty of everybody's sins, and the numerous public confessions in the stories of Dostoevsky and other Russian writers are therefore quite understandable, grotesque, and repulsive as they must appear to us. Our own deeds, good or bad, are nothing but pebbles in the river of life that will be carried on and on until they somehow touch our remotest fellow man. The individual is nothing and everything. The Makar includes in his prayers all those for whom nobody even prays. And there is also the Mysterium Caritatis. Not only does our guilt affect our fellow man, our forgiveness and love and equally pervasive. Father Zosimov's story of the duel and of the influence he unwittingly exercised upon the mysterious stranger who confessed to a murder is the most telling illustration of this belief. It finds, incidentally, an interesting parallel in Tolstoy's Father Sergius, written almost 20 years later. Dostoevsky's plots have no solution in our sense of word. Their solutions are spiritual, and the dominant theme is resurrection. This he has in common with the more Western Tolstoy, who is so different from him in many regards. Tolstoy's resurrection theme repeats itself in the spiritual clarity gained by his favorite characters such as Nekhludyov, Andrei, Pierre, Ivan Ilyich, and others. Resurrection occupies a more central position in Russian thinking than elsewhere, as the Russian word for it, Voskressenye, covers not only resurrection but also Sunday and Easter. It is no accident that the reading of the Lazarus story precedes Raskolnikov's confession, and that the dying Makar in A Raw Youth, as well as Zosima in The Brothers Karamazov, radiate a light that invades the souls of their fellow men. The past is buried, parentheses, quote, only where there are graves can resurrection be, close quote, says Nietzsche, close parentheses. And the future is all that counts. The sinner is part of God's mysterious design, and there are moments when a truly divine light appears over the most abject scenes of misery, as, for example, when Marmaladov, the alcoholic father of Sonia, the prostitute, breaks out in visionary ecstasy about Judgment Day. He knows that God will call to himself the drunkards, the weak, and the sinners, the quote-unquote swine, and tell the wise and prudent ones that he is calling the sinners to him, quote, because not one of them considered himself worthy of it, close quote. Then, so he believes, will all men understand, quote unquote, everything, and God's kingdom will indeed reign. Unlike Tolstoy, who demanded the abolition of all courts of justice, Dostoevsky considers man's judgment over man a necessity. All but judgments have to be passed in humility and love. The jury sentencing Dmitri consists of people socially and intellectually his inferior, the quote-unquote little peasants, and none of the clever Western arguments for milieu or hereditary are valid before God. The real community is aware of our all guilt, a state of mind present only in the church. We must never cease loving the sinner because God always continues to love him. True love and justice will prevail only when God's forgiveness speaks through humility, and no thoughts of moral superiority must ever enter our hearts. Such thinking was alien to Nietzsche. In denying the existence of true humanity, Nietzsche once remarked, "The believer feels superior to the unbeliever. I shall believe in Christian humility when I see how a believer humbles himself before the unbeliever." Close quote. Dostoevsky supplies striking answers to this challenge, of which he probably never heard, and Elder Zosimov kisses the old Karamazov after his most repulsive behavior in the monastery. The returning Christ kisses the Grand Inquisitor, who has been arrogant enough to reprove and threaten him. Alyosha kisses the cynical brother after the reading of the Grand Inquisitor's story. Western critics have called these scenes unacceptable because they were, quote-unquote, going too far. But the most Western philosopher, Nietzsche himself, had demanded just this proof for the existence of true humanity. Dostoevsky goes further than this. The sinner is repeatedly made the medium of forgiveness and salvation for the other sinners. In their childlike simplicity and honesty, the common people understand sin and guilt and are ready to forgive. They are a supremely religious body, and God may choose to use any of them for his purposes. Christ is on the road in Russia and may meet anyone in the disguise of a pilgrim or a wretched hobo, one of the miracle-working straniks, of which perhaps the corrupt Rasputin was the last and sinister example. Logic and human reasoning are inadequate to comprehend truth, and in this emphasis, Dostoevsky speaks entirely the language of Kierkegaard, of whom he had never heard. Christianity is a way of life, an existential condition. The elder Zosimov advises a doubting woman that there is, in religious matters, quote-unquote, nothing to prove. She will, so he assures her, become convinced of God's reality and the immortal state of her soul to the degree that she progresses in practicing love. Atheists fail to see this, yet we should not despise them. So the saintly elder warns us, because there are many good men among them, especially in modern times. Again, like Kierkegaard, who affirmed that suffering is the climate in which man's soul begins to breathe, Dostoevsky stresses the function of suffering as part of God's revelation of truth to man. The prosperous and emotional harmonious have never passed through this gate of hell. They can, therefore, not understand their fellow man who suffers. This emphasis on suffering arises from the pages of 19th century literature as part of our image of the Russian people, and becomes in turn a vast ocean of misery, a grace from heaven, a virtue, and a set of the Russian, quote-unquote, universal man. He will always suffer and crucify himself as long as there is one single human being who suffers. And Dostoevsky even says that Russian happiness is bound to contain some suffering, without which it would not be complete. Confession is only part of it and arises from the irrepressible urge to make others share in the experience of torture and guilt. The list of those confessing sins and crimes is long and varied. Raskolnikov, Nelly, Nastasia, Foma Fomich, and the mysterious stranger visiting the young Zarsimov, Arkady Stavrogin, in addition to others who confess without being guilty, like the prisoner Nikolay, shouting out his confessions of the murder that had been committed by Raskolnikov. And these make by no means a complete roster of Dostoevsky's confessors. For the grandiose and worldly wise fascism of the cardinal is, in more than one sense, a confession. Christ returned to this world in Seville, Spain, in the days of the Inquisition, is no second coming in the glorious setting of the ruler who had long last come into his own. The many paradoxes of this scene start with Jesus' arrest by the Grand Inquisitor. There could hardly be a more apt confirmation for the claim of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche that our Christian authorities are no longer Christian than to see the cardinal, parentheses, the church, close parentheses, arrest Jesus. while the simple people kneel down and worship the returning Christ, the cardinal knows better. Tomorrow they will come to watch the doomed prisoner burned at the stake. Man wants neither God nor Christ. He wants the authority of the church. It is, of course, symbolical that it is an atheist who tells this story in which the cardinal defends the practices of the church. The atheist's logical sequence is materialism and the conviction that man is too weak to live a life in God. He wants the physical security of bread. He seeks the spiritual security of dogma, of proof, or the truth of miracles. To believe in God and to undertake to follow Him irrespective of the consequences. That is too much of a risk to take, as the Grand Inquisitor suggests. The Church gives man a lighter burden to carry. It preaches, explains, and selects the truth, forgives sins, and bestows the happiness of children upon man. The price demanded for this is high. Man must surrender his freedom of thought, but he willingly does so. He no longer serves God as God may demand of him, but as the Church tells him. God's mysteries and miracles will henceforth be monopolized and administered by the Church. The political implications of the legend are now, of course, of the greatest interest to us who have witnessed most tragedies on the broadest dimensions. The Inquisitor's verdict about the fickle masses, the men and women who will always exchange their freedom for bread, who will confess whose own confessions of unhappiness, and finally Alyosha's verdict that the cardinal no longer represents faith but unbelief, surrounds the exciting legend with a sense of prophetic accusation. For the cardinal, God has died, as Nietzsche was to proclaim only a few years later in the first part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The cardinal could no longer believe in a man who had given up believing in God. Even so did the dictators of recent history reduce or eliminate their scruples about the treatment of their fellow beings by first removing religious considerations from their hearts. Like the cardinal, they employed the fascination of economic miracles, the mystery of thought control, and the unchecked authority. Dostoevsky's Legend of the Grand Inquisitor expresses with equal clarity his opposition to the Roman Catholic Church, political dictatorship, and communism. The scene between Christ and the Grand Inquisitor is incidentally a powerful example of the direct communication which Dostoevsky has less consciously employed than Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. The cardinal, as the advocate of evil, is quite verbose. He appears logical and persuasive. His arguments are saturated with worldly wise experience, but Christ remains mute. Truth exists by its own majesty. Its mysterious language is silence. Dostoevsky's criticism of the church and his penchant for psychological treatment of religious and moral conflict should, however, not make us forget that he was all of his life a believer in the mission of the church. It may be safe to say that he loved the church more than what it might have been or yet become, than for what it represented in its actuality. His love for the church was an unhappy one, and it may be symbolical that some of the sinners or abnormal characters are able to minister to their fellow men with more profound effect than ordained priests. Obviously, the wisdom of the church is confounded, and those living on the margin of respectable society are also God's spokesmen. Yet, critical as Dostoevsky was to the church, we may conclude from the scene in which Jesus kisses the Grand Inquisitor that he considers this kiss a sign of absolutionism from guilt, or at least a magnificent promise. Let me check, still going? I'll just do this real quick. Was Dostoevsky a believer? It is impossible to answer this question. He loved his atheists and seemed to cherish their arguments. In fact, we know how proud he was of cynical Ivan's powerful figure. Certainly Dostoevsky was no firm believer in the naive and unshaken kind. He had gone through, quote-unquote, the furnace of doubt. But his oscillations between believing and doubting suggests a wrestling with faith alien to the avowed atheist. His contradictions were too passionate and tense to allow an easy answer. We are left to conclude from his art of dramatizing darkness how much he longed for the light. A doubter of his proportion is always a believer also at certain moments in their life. But it is safe to assume that he always loved Christ. He even went so far as to state that he would choose Christ even if it could be proven that Christ was not the truth. The Orthodox faith in the immortality of the soul is a favorite topic in the conversions of several of his characters, who stress that a moral life on earth becomes senseless without the balancing justice after death. In fact, one might as well commit suicide to end all of life's miseries if there was no hereafter. But while this compensating justice in eternity will strengthen us here and now, and Kierkegaard is already here for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, the elder Zosimov sees the breach between God and man and between the state and the church healed in the communion of all believers, quote, at the end of the centuries, close quote, when it will bring about a magnificent paradise. Already now, quote, life is a paradise, and all of us are in the paradise if we would only realize this. If we would only see this, then paradise would arise tomorrow all over the world, not only in our ideas, but in reality, close quote. Russian Orthodoxy has never recognized the dualism between church and world, or time and eternity, nor does it admit a rupture between the two worlds of spirit and matter. The church itself is a point in the creation where the two meet and are reconciled, quote, in a new spirituality within the world, close quote, that has crossed the invisible boundaries between time and eternity and expands our vision beyond measure.